This was the case that kept me awake at night, long after it was solved. My name is Jack Monroe, and I'm a private investigator with over 20 years of experience tracking down the truth. It wasn't just the mystery. It was the way it clawed its way into every corner of my mind, leaving questions I could never quite answer. Of all the investigations I've taken, this one stands out as the most unexplainable, the one I revisit when the silence becomes too loud. Manhattan on a stormy night is both electric and foreboding, a city alive with contradictions. The rain lashed against the towering skyscrapers, streaking their mirrored surfaces with silvery trails that reflected the neon glow of the city below. Crowds hurried through the streets, umbrellas jostling like restless waves under a dark sea. It was a night of contrasts, chaos and silence, glamour and shadows. Inside the Prescott Foundation's grand ballroom, the atmosphere was far removed from the storm outside. The annual charity gala was in full swing, its chandeliers casting a warm golden light over Manhattan's elite. Champagne glasses clinked against the backdrop of a string quartet, and the buzz of polite conversation filled the room. This was the world Emily Prescott had been born into, a life of privilege, responsibility, and scrutiny. Emily, the sole heiress to the multi-billion-dollar Prescott empire, had long been a fixture of the city's social scene. She was beautiful, poised and fiercely intelligent, with a sharp wit that often left those around her either enchanted or unnerved. But beneath the polished exterior, those close to her whispered about the cracks that had begun to show in recent months, tensions within the family, whispered arguments at board meetings, and the unmistakable weight of expectation pressing down on her. Her father, Richard Prescott, was a self-made man who had built his empire from the ground up. The Prescott name was synonymous with power, but it came with a cost. Richard's relentless drive had alienated his first wife, Emily's mother, who had left the family when Emily was just a teenager. Richard's second wife, Vivian, was as polished as the diamond necklaces she wore, but had a distant, almost transactional relationship with Emily. Then there was Daniel, Emily's stepbrother, a charming opportunist who had always resented her position as the rightful heir. But no one could have imagined that by the end of the night, Emily Prescott would disappear without a trace. The last known footage of Emily captured her on the steps of the Prescott Foundation, arguing with a man whose face was obscured by the rain. The exchange was brief but heated. Moments later, she was seen hurrying toward the valet, her shoulders hunched as if to shield herself from more than just the storm. Her sleek black car disappeared into the night, its taillights swallowed by the rain-drenched streets. Hours later, her car was found abandoned on a remote stretch of the Taconic Parkway. The interior was pristine, save for a single smudge on the passenger side window. The driver's seatbelt was unbuckled, and Emily's handbag lay on the floor, untouched. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of where she had gone. The only sound on that desolate road was the steady drum of rain against the asphalt. The media descended on the story like vultures, painting Emily as the city's newest mystery. Speculation ran wild: kidnapping, a planned escape, or foul play. Conspiracy theories flooded social media, but the Prescotts, usually masters of public relations, remained eerily silent. Richard Prescott, the patriarch who had built his empire on unwavering control, was now a man unraveling before the cameras. "To whoever has my daughter," he pleaded on live television, his voice breaking, "I beg you, bring her back." For all his wealth and power, Richard Prescott could do nothing but wait. The police were already involved, combing through surveillance footage and interviewing gala attendees. But the Prescotts didn't trust them to handle the case discreetly, not with the media frenzy surrounding them. That's where I came in. As a private investigator with over 20 years of experience, I've made a career of finding people who don't want to be found, or in this case, people who couldn't be. I wasn't a stranger to high-profile cases, but something about this one felt different. The Prescotts weren't just hiring me to find Emily, they were hiring me to protect their name. And in my experience, when people care more about their reputation than the truth is usually something they want to hide. Stepping into the Prescott estate was like entering another world, a gilded cage where every detail spoke of wealth and influence. The marble floors gleamed under the crystal chandeliers, and the walls were adorned with oil portraits of stern-faced ancestors. Yet despite its grandeur, there was a tension in the air, something unsaid that seemed to echo through the empty hallways. Emily Prescott greeted me in the drawing room, her manicured fingers wrapped around a delicate teacup. She had the polished demeanor of someone who had perfected the art of appearances, but her eyes betrayed a hint of unease. "Emily's been under so much stress lately," she said, her voice carefully measured. Between the Foundation's demands and personal matters, it's no wonder she seemed distant. "What kind of personal matters?" I asked, watching her closely. Vivian hesitated, her gaze darting toward the window. "I'm not sure." She was private about her struggles. Her deflection was subtle, but it didn't go unnoticed. Richard Prescott entered the room moments later, his presence commanding despite the weariness etched into his face. He wasted no time on pleasantries. "You've been briefed on the situation," he said. "Find her, Mr. Monroe, whatever it takes." It was clear that Richard wasn't just concerned about Emily's safety. He was worried about the Prescott name. A scandal of this magnitude could tarnish the carefully constructed legacy he'd spent decades building. Then there was Daniel Prescott, Emily's stepbrother. He was leaning casually against the fireplace when I entered his office, a glass of scotch in hand. Daniel was all charm, with the easy confidence of someone who'd never been told no. "We had our differences, sure," he said when I asked about his relationship with Emily. "She didn't always agree with my decisions regarding the family's investments, but disagreements are part of business." His tone was light, but his words carried an undercurrent of resentment. It was clear that Daniel had never been comfortable playing second fiddle to his stepsister, the golden child of the Prescott family. As I walked through the estate, piecing together the fragments of their strained relationships, a picture began to emerge. The Prescotts were a family bound by wealth and power, but fractured by secrets and rivalries. Finding Emily wouldn't just mean uncovering what happened that night. It would mean unraveling the intricate web of lies holding this family together. The first promising lead came from the security footage at the gala. The grainy video showed Emily arguing with a man in the rain, a man who wasn't on the guest list. His face was partially obscured, but his posture was tense, his gestures sharp. As I studied the footage, something about the exchange nagged at me. Who was this man, and what could he possibly want with Emily? I tracked down a valet who remembered the incident. "He didn't belong," the young man said, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Wore a cheap suit. He handed her something, a note maybe, and they argued." She looked upset. The valet's account was corroborated by a server who'd seen the man lurking near the ballroom entrance earlier in the evening. "He was watching her," she said, like he was waiting for the right moment. With the help of a sketch artist, we created an image of the man. The likeness was plastered across news outlets and social media, generating dozens of tips. One stood out. A bartender at a dive bar on the Lower East Side recognized him. "Went by Ryan," the bartender said. "Didn't talk much, but he asked a lot of questions. About the Prescotts, about Emily." When I reviewed the bar's security footage, my gut twisted. The man in the baseball cap and cheap jacket matched the sketch. He was sitting at the far end of the bar, his head down, but his posture screamed tension. Ryan wasn't just a random stranger. He was connected to Emily in ways that were becoming increasingly clear and increasingly dangerous. Each new lead felt like a piece of a puzzle that refused to fit. Emily's car, abandoned on the Taconic Parkway, yielded no fingerprints other than her own. Her phone was missing, and there was no activity on her bank accounts. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. But there was one clue I couldn't ignore, a smudge on the passenger side window. It was faint, almost invisible, but it suggested someone else had been in the car. The smudge wasn't a fingerprint, it was more like a blurred streak, something left behind by hurried movement. I returned to the scene of the car's discovery, walking the stretch of road in the rain. The woods on either side were dense, the kind of place where someone could disappear without a trace. The faint scent of damp leaves and wet earth hung heavy in the air. I imagined the moment. Emily, alone in the car, the rain pounding on the windshield. Did she willingly let someone in? Or was she forced to? The scene whispered of silence and isolation, but it offered no clear answers. Not far from the car, the muddy shoulder of the road bore faint tracks. I followed them, my flashlight cutting through the haze of rain, but the trail dissolved into the woods. Every step felt heavier with questions. A tip from the bartender about Ryan gave me the next lead. The man Emily had argued with at the gala wasn't a stranger to her, and his name had come up before in whispers from the Prescott staff. With some digging, I discovered a postcard with coordinates scribbled hastily on the back. It pointed to a remote cabin nestled deep in the Catskill Mountains. The path to the cabin was overgrown, littered with fallen branches and blanketed in damp moss. The structure itself was barely standing, with a sagging roof and walls warped by years of exposure. The windows were boarded up and the air carried a heavy sense of abandonment. Inside, the cabin was a monument to obsession. Maps were pinned to the walls, each marked with locations tied to Emily's known movements. Receipts, notes, and scrawled dates covered a table in the corner. At the center of it all was a photograph of Emily, her face circled in red ink. The scrawled annotations on the map, times, venues, and notes about Emily's routines, painted a chilling picture of someone tracking her every move. Pinned above the desk was a calendar with specific dates meticulously highlighted. The gala date was among them, along with board meetings and charity events. This wasn't just stalking, this was strategy. Whoever had been staying here had been calculating their approach for months. My stomach tightened when I saw it. Emily's necklace, a delicate gold chain resting on the table, coiled as though deliberately left behind. Its presence felt like a deliberate statement, and its placement suggested a mix of sentiment and intent. Had she been here willingly? Or had she left it behind as a breadcrumb for someone, for me? The air inside the cabin was thick, the silence almost oppressive. As I examined the space, a creak from outside made me freeze. My flashlight flicked toward the window and I caught a fleeting glimpse of movement. Someone had been watching me. Gripping the flashlight tightly, I stepped out into the rain. The forest felt alive with shadows, each one shifting as I moved. The beam of light bounced off tree trunks and low-hanging branches, but the figure I'd seen was gone. The faint sound of rustling leaves faded, leaving only the rhythmic patter of rain. Whatever answers the cabin held, they would have to wait until daylight. The figure in the shadows, the smudge on the car window, the carefully orchestrated notes, they all pointed to a dark truth. I wasn't just investigating a disappearance. I was unraveling an obsession, one that had spiraled into something far more dangerous. The cabin felt alive with secrets, each creak of its rotting wood adding to the tension that gnawed at me. By the time the morning light pierced through the dense canopy of trees, I had already pored over every inch of the room. The maps on the walls, the calendar, and the carefully scrawled notes spoke of meticulous planning. Ryan hadn't just been following Emily. He'd been consumed by her. One note in particular caught my attention, a list of events that Emily had attended, with precise times and locations. It wasn't just a stalker's obsession. This was strategy, a methodical tracking of her movements. But for what purpose? To confront her? To control her? Or worse? Then there was her necklace. Its delicate gold chain glinted faintly in the light, a stark reminder of her presence here. Had she been brought here against her will? Or had she left it behind as a message, a breadcrumb to lead me closer to the truth? The weight of that question hung heavily in the air. As I stepped outside to clear my head, the stillness of the forest pressed in on me. But it wasn't silent. Not entirely. The faint sound of rustling leaves made me freeze. Turning slowly, I saw nothing but shadows. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Whatever answers lay hidden in this place, I knew I wasn't the only one searching for them. The deeper I delved into Ryan's twisted mind, the clearer it became that he was only part of the story. Among the scattered papers, I found a series of encrypted emails on a dusty old laptop. The name on the account wasn't Ryan's, but Emily's. The messages revealed a chilling dynamic. Emily had been in contact with Ryan for months, feeding into his delusions, manipulating his obsession. She'd crafted a narrative of desperation, convincing him that she needed to escape her oppressive family. But the more I read, the more her true intentions began to surface. Emily's ultimate goal wasn't escape, it was control. She knew the power her disappearance would wield, the chaos it would unleash within her family. The media frenzy alone had already tarnished the Prescott name, and her father's frantic attempts to restore order only made him appear weaker. Ryan's anger was palpable in his final emails. He'd realized too late that he was a pawn in her game. His messages became increasingly erratic, shifting between pleading for her to explain herself and vowing revenge. It was clear their alliance had fractured, and that fracture had driven Ryan to act impulsively. The pieces began to fall into place. Emily had staged her own disappearance using Ryan as a tool to execute her plan. But when he discovered her betrayal, he'd taken matters into his own hands. The cabin was a testament to their unraveling, a shrine to obsession that had spiraled into violence. A tip from an anonymous source led me to a crumbling warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The air inside was damp and stifling, the faint hum of machinery echoing through the vast, empty space. My footsteps rang hollow against the concrete floor as I moved deeper into the shadows. In the center of the room, Ryan stood over Emily, his face twisted with anger and regret. He held a gun, its barrel trembling as he pointed it at her. Emily's hands were tied, but her expression was calm, almost defiant. "You lied to me," Ryan spat, his voice raw with emotion. "You used me." "And you let me," Emily replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "You wanted to believe in the story I gave you." For a moment, the tension was unbearable. Ryan's finger twitched on the trigger, but I stepped forward, my voice cutting through the stillness. "Ryan, this isn't the way," I said, keeping my tone calm but firm. "Put the gun down. Don't let her win." His eyes flicked toward me, and for a moment I saw the conflict within him. Then, with a guttural yell, he flung the gun to the ground and collapsed to his knees. The police, who had been waiting outside, swarmed in moments later, taking him into custody. Emily Prescott vanished again, but this time it was deliberate. After the chaos of the warehouse, she disappeared from the public eye, leaving her family to pick up the pieces of their shattered legacy. Her father's reputation never recovered, and the Prescott Foundation became a shadow of its former self. Months later, whispers began to surface of a woman matching Emily's description living in Europe. Her identity changed, her fortune intact. She'd left behind the gilded cage of her family's influence, trading it for a life of freedom, a life she'd orchestrated with chilling precision. As I closed the file on Emily's case, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. She'd played everyone, Ryan, her family, even me, and she'd won. But at what cost? The truth wasn't black and white. It never is. Emily's story was one of survival, of reclaiming control in a world that sought to dominate her. But it was also a story of betrayal, manipulation, and the lengths people will go to for freedom. Even now, as I sit in my office and watch the rain streak down the window, I find myself wondering, was Emily a victim, a villain, or something in between? The case may be closed, but the shadows it left behind still linger.